More than half of death penalty sentences in the United States come from just 2% of counties, and one of those counties is none other than our own, Cuyahoga County. From 2018 to 2022, Cuyahoga County has led the nation in death sentences. A troubling statistic for many reasons, but especially when we consider that Cuyahoga County leads the state of Ohio in wrongful convictions. Over the past 20 years, public support for the death penalty has steadily declined. In 2023, Gallup polling showed for the first time that a majority of Americans feel the death penalty is unfairly applied. Research also confirms that the use of the death penalty is biased, prone to error, does not deter crime, and is painful for the victims' families. Let's dive into the topic. As of 2023, 29 states have either abolished the death penalty or paused executions. Several states that still use the death penalty haven't performed an execution in over a decade. Ohio has not conducted an execution in 5 years because of limited access to the drugs commonly used for lethal injections. In Ohio, there is an ongoing bipartisan effort to abolish the death penalty. Both Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature agree that it is bad policy. For over a decade, there has been a bill introduced in every legislative session to ban the use of the death penalty. Representative Jean Schmidt, a very conservative Republican, changed her stance on the death penalty after speaking with exonerees from death row, recognizing the flaws in a process that is ineffective, prone to error, and irreversible. She has reintroduced a bill to ban the death penalty in the Ohio House. Attorney General David Yost is a proponent of the death penalty, but he also understands that Ohio is wasting taxpayer dollars on the death penalty, stating that the death penalty in Ohio is a broken capital punishment system that produces, and I quote, churn, waste, and endless lawsuits and nothing else. It is a system that is not fairly, equally, or promptly enforced, and because of that, it invites distrust and disrespect for the rule of law. End quote. The Ohio Senate bill is sponsored by Democrat Nikki Antonio and Republican Stephen Huffman, and also has substantial bipartisan support. It is important to question why the current prosecutor continues to defend his use of the death penalty, given the strong bipartisan efforts to abolish it. Let's dive into the policy research that exists on the topic. The United Nations, Amnesty International, the ACLU, and other organizations agree that capital punishment is cruel. The ACLU explains that the death penalty is administered arbitrarily and in a discriminatory manner, while the process itself is inhumane and in some cases qualifies as torture. The death penalty is permanent, with no way to correct a mistake when an innocent person is executed. Ohio has executed 56 people since the death penalty was reinstated. The state has also exonerated 11 people. In other words, for every 5 executions, there is 1 exoneration. The death penalty is sought more often when the victim is white. 75% of death sentences are for cases with a white victim, despite black victims making up 50% of murder victims. Death penalty cases are often marred by prosecutorial and police misconduct, and this happens more often in cases with a black defendant. The black population is overrepresented on death row, making up 43% of the population of those awaiting the death penalty. This is alarming, considering that black individuals make up only 14% of the population of the United States. It is estimated that the death penalty costs up to $3 million more per case than a life in prison sentence. This is a cost that falls upon the taxpayer. And while criminals who commit very serious offenses require serious accountability, the death penalty is not necessary to achieve this. A persistent myth is often used to defend the use of capital punishment, that of victim closure. But a study on the effect of the death penalty on families of murder victims shows that families living in a state without the death penalty had better mental, physical, and behavioral health than families who live in a state still using the death penalty. This is because these death penalty cases take a long time to resolve, postponing closure, and the most likely outcome of a death penalty case over the last several decades is that the death penalty sentence is actually overturned. Jonathan Mann, whose father was murdered in Cuyahoga County, explains his experience as a family member of a victim, and I quote, "It was clear that my voice as a victim didn't matter. Michael O'Malley became laser-focused on getting a conviction despite my family's objections. Essentially, Cuyahoga County used our family's darkest moment to gain political prestige, and that is one of the many ugly truths about the death penalty. Ohioans would be better served if the funding used to sustain lengthy death penalty cases was instead diverted to programs that support victims and their families." States that still use the death penalty do not have lower crime rates than states that have abolished the death penalty. Study after study confirms this, with some states showing a meaningfully reduced murder rate once they abolish the death penalty. When taking a look at crime statistics from the FBI, for every year from 1990 until 2019, states without the death penalty averaged a lower murder rate when compared to states with the death penalty. Lethal injection, which is the only approved method of execution in the state of Ohio, has become increasingly difficult to perform. Companies that were once the source of the necessary drugs needed to carry out the lethal injections no longer want their products to be used to kill people. Even with Ohio's secrecy law, which protects drug companies by granting them anonymity from the public, these companies have threatened to sue the state if it is found that their products were used in an execution. For this reason, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine postponed executions over the last 5 years, which has cost the state more money. The lack of drug supply leads to executions carried out under conditions that are unnecessarily brutal for the defendant. One journalist's account of one of Ohio's last executions shed light on the troubling process. During the execution, the state used a mix of drugs that had never been used before, which resulted in the defendant gasping for breath for 10 minutes. Ohio's executions have been under scrutiny for decades. In 2007, a task force studied the execution process in Ohio and found the state fell short of American Bar Association standards. In fact, the state failed to meet 93% of the ABA's standards for fairness and accuracy in a capital punishment system. Another consequence of capital punishment is the effect it has on corrections officers tasked with carrying out an execution. An NPR study found that most of the workers that they interviewed suffered severe mental and physical health effects without support from the government to deal with their trauma. It is necessary to consider, if the death penalty is riddled with problems, why does the current prosecutor defend his choice to seek the death penalty at such a high rate? The elected prosecutor has claimed that the high rate of crime in Cuyahoga County makes it necessary to seek the death penalty. He either does not understand the research or chooses to ignore the fact that the death penalty is biased, prone to error, does not deter crime, and is painful for the victims' families. In the first 5 full years of his tenure, Cuyahoga County sentenced more people to death than any other county in the country. The current prosecutor claims to work on behalf of victims, but routinely ignores the wishes of loved ones that his office not seek the death penalty in their cases. Robert Dunham, the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, notes that since murder rates have not skyrocketed during the current prosecutor's tenure, there is something about this particular prosecutor's office that is causing the large jump in the number of death penalty cases since he took office. Defendants found guilty of serious violent crimes must be held accountable, but the death penalty is a failed policy. By every objective measure, it has not delivered its intended results. It is costly, difficult to enact, and does not deter crime. It is a policy that harms our community by creating more victims and leaving no room to correct mistakes. 11 Republicans in the Ohio State Legislature recognize this. Cuyahoga County should not be lagging behind them, let alone leading the United States in this unjustifiable practice. I'm Matthew Ahn, and I approve this message.